Hey everybody, welcome to video 24. There's just a little bit more information that I wanted to cover before we start diving into the individual muscles of the human body, and that is three things that you're going to need to know, not necessarily super in-depth in this class, but especially moving forward in collegiate anatomy. There are a few things that you'll need to know for every single muscle you go over, and that is the action, origin, and the insertion. So action, origin, and insertion, abbreviated AOI, is very important to know when studying muscles because everything that you may study or may go into practice for related to muscles is going to depend on the AOI in some form or fashion. And actually at the collegiate level, you'll actually go over the AOIN, where you actually include the innervation, or what nerve is responsible for that muscle, in addition to the action, origin, and insertion. So, went over that really quickly, but that is what I just said there. So, the action of a muscle is basically its function. What is that muscle doing when that muscle contracts? This can be any of those joint movements that we had covered previously, both in our skeletal system and in our last video, or it could be something completely different. The main muscle that's going to be responsible for that action is called the prime mover, or sometimes you'll also see it called the agonist. Any muscle that is assisting the prime mover is known as the synergist. So when you're taking a look at a muscle, you might note that its action is the prime mover of this, or it is the synergist of this. There is a subcategory of synergists known as the fixator, which is going to be those muscles that are assisting the prime mover by stabilizing one of the bones that the prime mover is attached to. Muscles that move in the opposite contraction or direction, if you will, of a prime mover are going to be called the antagonists, and that's why you can see sometimes those prime movers are also known as the agonists. So origin and insertion, what are those? Skeletal muscles are generally going to attach to two bones, at least two bones, with some joint in between. One bone usually is going to be a very stationary bone, while the other, especially with our skeletal muscles, is going to be the one that is moving quite a bit when that joint moves. The stationary bone is going to be the attachment known as the origin. The bone that moves is then going to be called the insertion. So a muscle may have more than two attachments, but they'll have at least two attachments, except for your tongue. Your tongue is the only muscle that is only attached at one end. But the attachment point that does not move, or the attachment points that do not move, are the origin. And then the attachment point or points that move are then called the insertion. So we can see here the biceps brachii, how it is going to originate on that coracoid process of the scapula. It also has one head wrapping around that humeral head there. You know that when you contract your biceps brachii, the shoulder stays in place even though that biceps brachii is attached there. That biceps brachii is going to insert down on the radius there, on that forearm side, and when you contract that biceps brachii, you know that that radius is what's moving as that muscle contracts. Thus you can see how that muscle is originating and inserting. So how do origins and insertions relate to tendons and ligaments? The origins and insertions of muscles are generally composed of tendons. Tendons are always going to be that which attach a muscle to bone. Tendons are always going to be made of a dense connective tissue. Remember that connective tissue is one of the four tissue types. Ligaments, which got skipped over during the skeletal system, do not actually attach muscles. They actually attach bone to bone. So for example, your patella, your kneecap, has the quadriceps tendon attached to it because it is attaching the muscles of your quadriceps group to the bone of the patella. Inferior to the patella, you have the patellar ligament, because you have connective tissue attaching that patella to the tibia. Ligaments are also made of dense connective tissue, which is why I mentioned them here instead of in our skeletal system. You do have other attachments that aren't necessarily known as tendons. You can have an aponeurosis, which is a very broad sheet-like tendon that muscles are going to be attached to. You actually have an aponeurosis on the top of your head, so you think your frontalis muscle is not going to go directly into your frontal bone or to your parietal bones, but it's instead going to have an aponeurosis that's going to use that it is going to use that is then going to attach. Other muscles may not have a tendon or they may not have an aponeurosis, but they may actually attach directly to the skin that sits superficial to them, and we see that quite commonly in the muscles of the face. So again, that is action, origin, and insertion, three things that we're going to cover for all the major muscles that get covered in this unit. But they are also important to know, especially as you move on to higher level classes. When you study the muscular system, you will need to know action, origin, and insertion at the very least, and probably you'll also need to include innervation as well.